Okay, so we're diving into some seriously deep waters today. We're talking about Dave Smith on the Lex Fridman podcast.
Yeah, this one was dense.
It really was, and it goes everywhere. War, politics, conspiracies, even the power of podcasting itself.
The future of information, really.
That's it. And our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to extract the absolute gold from this massive conversation.
The insights, the arguments, the stuff that makes you go, whoa.
Hey, we're going to do it without overwhelming you. This is a deep dive, tailored for you. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
All right, so first things first, we got to talk about Dave Smith's take on military intervention. It's a pretty core theme throughout the whole conversation.
Absolutely. And he's not shy about his critique.
No, not at all. He uses the Iraq War as a prime example. Argues that it was basically a war built on, well, let's just say questionable foundations.
And he points to the fallout, right? The financial burden, the hit the dollar took.
The lack of accountability, too.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And it ties into his bigger point about how we frame our adversaries.
Dehumanizing them, calling them monsters.
Exactly. Smith says that kind of language actually makes diplomacy and negotiation way harder.
Because how do you find common ground with a monster?
You can't. And he thinks this plays into current conflicts, too. Like, take the Ukraine war.
Trump's come out pretty strongly about wanting to end it, says it's a top priority.
Which, raises a lot of questions.
For sure. And speaking of questions, there's this idea of insurgent math that comes up.
General McChrystal's term, right, about how fighting insurgents can sometimes backfire.
Yeah, like it creates more of them. Smith uses the Houthis in Yemen as an example.
And the growth of AQAP, Al-Qaeda, in the Arabian Peninsula.
Which he links, at least in part, to the increased use of drone strikes.
Kind of a paradox. You try to eliminate opposition with force, and it ends up growing stronger.
And you can see how this connects back to the warnings Ron Paul was giving, like, way back.
Before 9/11 even happened.
Smith talks about how Paul was saying that U.S. foreign policy in Muslim-majority countries was going to have consequences.
And being in New York City on 9/11, it really hit home for Smith.
Yeah, it made him rethink that whole "they hate our freedom" narrative.
Because there's a cultural dimension to these conflicts, right? It's not just about abstract freedom.
It's about resisting having values imposed on you, values you don't share.
Right. And this leads to another crucial point. The human cost of war.
Something Smith feels gets lost in the rhetoric.
He brings up Bret Stephens' piece on the Iraq War anniversary. Talks about how it focuses on comparing Saddam's regime to what came after.
Without really grappling with the millions who were killed or displaced.
The actual process of war, the suffering it creates.
And you can't just ignore that. It should make you think, like, what if it was your community being sacrificed for some bigger political goal?
Right. And this all feeds into that very human instinct for retaliation.
That tribal mentality, us versus them.
Smith sees this as a huge driver in conflicts like Israel-Palestine. And in the whole war on terror.
It's that deep-down urge to respond in kind when you feel attacked.
And that's where the military-industrial complex comes into play.
Ah, yes, the elephant in the room.
It's not just two sides fighting. There's this whole other entity with a vested interest in keeping the conflict going.
Because war is profitable, right?
Sadly, yeah. And Smith points out that they also have the resources to shape public opinion, to keep the war machine rolling.
It's interesting to think about how that's changed, though, the media landscape, I mean.
Yeah, with podcasts and all these independent voices, it's a whole new ballgame.
Back in the day, mainstream media basically had a monopoly on information. Smith uses the first Gulf War as an example.
No organic push for it from the public.
But now it's way harder to control the narrative. Which brings us to Smith's critique of American foreign policy.
And this whole idea of an empire mentality.
That the U.S. has this, like, almost divine right to intervene in other countries' affairs.
He mentions this sentiment of needing to find a puny little country to pick on every now and then.
And he really pushes back against that. He uses the example of Taiwan, asks if we should be going to war over that.
And he contrasts this with a libertarian view of just war.
Which is basically self-defense, right?
Yeah. He even uses a personal analogy. Someone attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself.
Makes sense. But he's very clear that things like civilian-to-combatant ratios shouldn't be the starting point for ethical discussions about war.
Or statements like, Hamas has to go.
Right. He argues that just wanting regime change doesn't justify harming civilians.
And it all comes down to empathy. He stresses the importance of having empathy for both sides.
For the Palestinians, he describes Gaza as a concentration camp.
where the daily struggles feel like 1,000 9/11s combined.
And he acknowledges the trauma Israelis experienced on October 7th.
It's about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those you disagree with.
And finding those glimmers of hope. Like, he points to historical examples of seemingly impossible reconciliations.
France and Germany, Egypt and Israel.
It can happen. He also brings up this fascinating analogy about slavery, attributed to Thomas Jefferson,
Holding a wolf by the ears.
where letting go is terrifying, but so is holding on. He sees it as relevant to the Israel-Palestine situation.
Stuck between a rock and a hard place. But he does see the normalization with Saudi Arabia as a possible step in the right direction.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict a bit more, and specifically the perspective on Hamas.
Smith tackles this head-on, engaging with what he calls a steelman argument from Douglas Murray, who's very pro-Israel.
Just to clarify, a steelman argument is basically presenting the strongest possible version of the opposing view before critiquing it.
Right, and Murray paints this picture of Hamas as a fanatical death cult,
claiming they care more about fighting Israel than they do about their own people.
and that there might be widespread support for their actions, citing things like the 2005 elections and the celebrations after attacks on Israel.
Which are, deeply troubling to see.
Absolutely, yeah. But Smith pushes back against this narrative. He frames his own position as against the government, for the people.
Against the powerful, sympathetic to the powerless.
Right, and he questions how we can judge the choices of people living in Gaza.
Generations of refugees, under blockade, in desperate conditions.
It makes you think about those historical parallels, like the repression in the Soviet Union or China.
Didn't extinguish the desire for freedom or national identity.
Exactly. And he points out that support for Hamas has always fluctuated depending on things like peace talks or military campaigns.
Suggesting it's not some unchanging, monolithic entity.
Right. And then he challenges this idea of calling Israel a democracy without acknowledging its history.
The forced displacement of Palestinians. Historian Benny Morris called it transfer.
And the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territory since '67, which Smith sees as basically annexation.
It's a complicated situation for sure. He also highlights the huge disparity in casualties.
Roughly 20 Palestinians killed for every Israeli.
Makes you question that whole death cult label for Hamas, especially when you consider the impact of Israeli actions on civilians.
Like that tragic story of the 8-year-old girl,
Mm-hmm.
an innocent child caught in the crossfire.
It's heartbreaking. And Smith expresses doubt about the sincerity of Israeli claims about avoiding civilian casualties.
Points to things like soldiers signing bombs, rhetoric that dehumanizes Palestinians.
It's a tough conversation to have. And then there's that whole controversy about Tucker Carlson's comment.
Asking if Israel intentionally kills children.
Yeah. And Smith uses this to talk about the ethics of war versus domestic crime.
He uses a murder analogy. Says you wouldn't justify a murderer using human shields in a domestic setting.
Right, and he argues that the Israel-Gaza conflict is unique because it's not a war between two states.
It's an occupying power against a people who are largely denied their own government.
Which, he suggests, puts a greater responsibility on Israel to act more like a police force.
To minimize harm to civilians. It's a complex argument for sure.
Okay, switching gears a bit, we gotta talk about Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, this is a whole other can of worms.
Full of unanswered questions. Smith expresses this frustration that many people feel. The lack of transparency.
Like, where are the tapes everyone keeps talking about?
And why are there redactions for national security in a pedophile ring investigation?
It just doesn't add up.
And he mentions the growing suspicion about intelligence agency involvement, MSAD, CIA, FSB.
Though he's careful to say that it's speculation at this point.
Right, but the bigger point is that this lack of accountability erodes trust in institutions.
He connects it to other major events, like the Iraq War, the pandemic lockdowns.
There's this sense that those in power aren't held responsible.
And he argues that transparency in the Epstein case is crucial to rebuilding that trust.
It's about more than just one case. It's about the whole system.
Exactly. And on a more personal note, Smith shares this experience he had, being accused of coming out of nowhere.
And he ties it to this human tendency to seek out simple narratives, conspiracy theories, often.
Because it's comforting to have an easy explanation.
But the truth is usually way more complex. And he gives a shout out to comedians.
For having the guts to talk about uncomfortable truths. Okay, let's shift gears again to the media landscape.
It's changing so fast. Smith talks about the decline of mainstream media's influence.
And the rise of independent platforms like podcasts.
It's a whole new ball game, and politicians are having to adapt,
Trump, Biden, Netanyahu, they've all been on podcasts.
reaching out to audiences directly. And Smith argues that these long-form conversations are incredibly valuable.
They reveal a person's character in a way that sound bites or edited interviews just can't.
He even mentions a slight regret about his own interview with Netanyahu.
Wishes it had been longer, more time to dig deeper.
And he talks about this idea of creating conversations that will be valuable to historians in the future.
Preserving a record of this moment in time, without the spin.
And this all ties back to the importance of recognizing the humanity of those we consider enemies.
Even figures like Putin or the Houthi leaders.
Smith argues that they have their own perspectives, their own grievances.
And we need to understand them if we want to find solutions. Okay, last big topic. Historical analogies.
Smith is very critical of how they're often used, especially comparisons to World War II.
It's so easy to fall into that trap. Appeasement versus aggression, stopping the next Hitler.
But he argues that it oversimplifies things, and he specifically challenges the comparison of Hamas to the Nazis.
Points out the huge difference in scale and threat,
And the hypocrisy of the U.S. being the only country to have actually used nuclear weapons.
while simultaneously worrying about other countries getting them.
It's a valid point. He also expresses skepticism towards constant conspiracy theories.
He uses examples like the 9/11 Truth Movement, the PNAC document, Silverstein's insurance policy,
To illustrate how clinging to a belief can warp your interpretation of the facts.
and he contrasts this with the importance of doubt, of intellectual humility, knowing that you don't have all the answers.
Which is a good lesson for all of us. But despite all these heavy topics, Smith does offer some reasons for optimism.
He mentions historical examples cited by Jeffrey Epstein, radical changes that seemed impossible at the time.
Like the abolition of slavery, the collapse of the Soviet Union.
History is full of surprises, and he sees the shift in the media landscape as another positive development.
The old gatekeepers losing their control over information.
It's harder to control the narrative now, which makes propaganda, like the kind we saw before the Iraq War, much more difficult.
It's empowering in a way. And finally, he points to technological progress, especially in space exploration and medicine.
He shares a personal story about his son's successful surgery for a congenital heart defect.
It's a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, our ability to solve problems, even the really tough ones.
It gives you hope for the future.
It really does. So let's take a moment to recap. We've covered a lot of ground here.
The complexities of war and its unintended consequences.
The different perspectives on the Israel-Palestine conflict.
The need for transparency and critical thinking in this age of information overload.
The power of new media. The dangers of simplistic historical comparisons.
And ultimately, the potential for positive change, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges.
It's a lot to process, but hopefully you're walking away with some new insights, some new questions to ponder.
And a greater understanding of these complex issues.
And with that, I'll leave you with one final thought. This is for you to chew on. Given this fragmentation of media, the rise of individual creators,
How do you think this will continue to disrupt power structures and influence global events?
what are the potential benefits and the risks?
It's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.